Before this story begins, one thing needs to be made clear. When a man puts on a military uniform and leaves his family to serve his country, he accepts the risk that he may never return. He accepts the possibility of death, of injury, and of long, lonely nights on the battlefield. But there is one thing no man ever signs up to accept. No one is prepared for it. That is the moment he comes home after months of surviving amid bombs and gunfire, only to discover that in the very bed he once called home, the woman he trusted completely now belongs to someone else. John Harper sat upright in the backseat of the taxi, his blue eyes lighting up each time he looked toward the white two-story house at the end of the street, the home he had missed for 8 long months. He hadn't told anyone he was coming back. He wanted it to be a surprise. He wanted to see the look of shock, then joy on Sarah's face when he suddenly appeared at the door. In the military duffel beside him were the gifts he had chosen with care, a hand-knitted wool scarf for his wife, and a bright red fire truck for Lucas, the very toy the boy had been longing for since their last video call. "Thank you." John handed over the fare and stepped out of the car slowly, as if trying to stretch this moment just a little longer. He stood still for a moment, took a deep breath, and let the calm of the quiet street sink in the peace he had craved through countless long nights lying in a military tent in a distant desert. Then he heard it. Clear, bright laughter ringing like silver bells. Lucas John turned toward the front yard, and his heart seemed to bloom. His 4-year-old son was squatting beside the sandbox, his sandy blonde hair tousled and dusty, his round face flushed pink from the afternoon sun. The boy was deeply focused on building a sandcastle, his tongue sticking out in concentration. Lucas John called again, his voice catching with emotion. The boy startled and looked up. For a brief moment, the blue eyes, so much like his father's, were still unfocused. Then they widened, shining like stars. Daddy Lucas jumped to his feet and ran toward John as fast as a 4-year-old could manage. He threw himself into his father's arms, small hands wrapped tightly around John's neck, his face buried in his father's shoulder. John knelt down and hugged him close, one hand, gently stroking the boy's soft hair. The familiar scent of children's shampoo filled his nose, mixed with the smell of dirt and warm afternoon sun. "I missed you so much, Lucas." John whispered, his eyes wet with tears. "I missed you too." Lucas looked up, his chubby cheeks rosy. "Are you home now? Are you going to stay home forever?" "Yes, I'm home. I'm staying here with you and Mom now." John smiled, but the smile slowly faded as he looked around. The front yard was quiet. The front door was closed. Sarah's car was still parked in the garage. And yet, "Where's Mom, Lucas?" John asked, keeping his tone gentle. "Is she home?" Lucas nodded, his innocent eyes fixed on his father. "Yes, Mom's inside." "Then why didn't she come out to meet Daddy?" "She's in her room," Lucas said brightly, without a trace of hesitation. Then he turned and pointed up at the second-floor window, the master bedroom window, its curtains drawn tightly shut. "She's in there, Daddy. The door's locked. She told me to play outside and not go in and bother her." A chill ran down John's spine. "What? What is Mom doing in there?" he asked, his voice beginning to tense. Lucas shrugged, unconcerned. "I don't know, but I hear talking. Mom's talking to someone." He paused, then added in the most innocent tone imaginable, "Mom's playing with Uncle David." Time seemed to stop. The air around John grew thick and heavy, so dense he felt he could barely breathe. The name David rang in his head like an alarm bell. David Morrison. Sarah's cousin, the man John had never felt comfortable about, the man who always found reasons to stop by their house, who was always just a little too familiar with Sarah in ways John couldn't quite explain but could never ignore. "Uncle David," John repeated hoarsely. He's in the room with Mom." "Yes." Lucas nodded, still unaware of the storm gathering inside his father. "I saw him come in around noon. Then Mom told me to go play outside and not make noise." John slowly stood up, his legs stiff and numb. He looked up at the second-floor window, the room he and Sarah had shared so many memories in, where they had built their dream of a happy family together. Now, the tightly drawn curtains felt like a wall hiding something he was afraid to imagine. "Buddy." John bent down and rested a hand on Lucas's shoulder, forcing his voice to stay calm despite the whirlwind raging inside him. "You keep playing out here, okay? Daddy's going to go inside for a minute, and then I'll come back out and play with you." "Will you give me my present?" Lucas asked, his eyes lighting up. "I will. I promise." John forced a smile, gently ruffled his son's hair, and then straightened up. John stood in the first-floor hallway, his eyes fixed on the wooden staircase leading up to the second floor. Sarah's laughter drifted down once again, a sound so familiar it hurt. But this time, it carried no warmth. It was like a dagger, each burst of laughter piercing straight through his chest. He began to climb the stairs. Every step took effort. His hand gripped the wooden banister so tightly that his knuckles turned white. In his mind, memories of Sarah flickered past like old film reels, their wedding day, her white dress flowing softly, the goodbye kiss at the airport 8 months earlier, the love letters she had written to him while he was deployed. All of it now felt like pages curling and burning in a very real fire. He stopped in front of the bedroom door. It was slightly ajar, leaving a narrow crack. Warm, yellow light spilled out, cutting across his face like a burn. John stood still, let out a slow breath, and closed his eyes for a few seconds. He prayed that this was all a misunderstanding, that David was just visiting, that Sarah was sick and needed help, that there was a reasonable explanation for everything. But when he opened his eyes and gently pushed the door, every one of those prayers collapsed into ashes. Sarah was sitting on the bed, her long brown hair loose around her shoulders, her silk nightgown slipping off one shoulder. Beside her was David Morrison, or rather not the cousin Lucas had mentioned, but David Thompson, John's closest friend since basic training, the man John had trusted with his secrets, the man he had called a brother in arms. Time froze. Sarah flinched, her brown eyes widening as she saw John. The color drained from her face, her mouth opening without a sound. David turned around. The flash of surprise on his face quickly gave way to something that looked like helplessness or, worse, acceptance. No one spoke. The only sound in the room was the steady ticking of the wall clock, a sound John had once found comforting, now unbearably loud. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the curtains, falling across the creases in the bedsheets, the very sheets John had bought as a birthday gift for Sarah the year before. "John," Sarah finally spoke, her voice trembling. You're home." John didn't answer. He stood there, his eyes taking in every detail of the room, as if documenting a battlefield. David's shirt lay tossed on the floor. A glass of red wine sat on the nightstand. The scent of Sarah's perfume mixed with David's aftershave, two unfamiliar smells now blending in a space that was supposed to belong only to him and his wife. Then John spoke. His voice was low, cold as ice. "You once told me that brotherhood on the battlefield was sacred," John said, looking straight at David. "You said it was the reason we survived, the reason we made it home to our families." David lowered his head, unable to meet his gaze. John turned to Sarah. "And you? You were the only reason I clung to life while lying in a fighting trench. You were the only light I could see when everything else was darkness and explosions." His voice did not shake. He did not shout. Yet each word fell like a heavy stone into the silence of the room, sending out painful ripples. Sarah broke down, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But John didn't want to hear it. He turned away and walked out of the room with a terrifying calm, the kind of composure only a soldier hardened by strict discipline could possess. There was no yelling, no destruction, only a crushing silence heavier than any words. He went down the stairs one step at a time, his legs weighed down as if carrying the entire world. When he reached the first floor, he felt as though he had aged 10 years. This white-painted house, the symbol of every dream he had held onto for 8 long months, was now nothing more than an empty shell, cold and filled with shadows. John stepped out into the backyard. Lucas was sitting on the swing, his small legs pumping back and forth. When he saw his father, the boy jumped down and ran over with a bright smile. "Daddy, are you going to play with me now?" John bent down and lifted Lucas into his arms. The boy wrapped his arms around his father's neck, his warm breath against John's ear. It was the only thing left intact in this collapsing world, his innocent son untouched by the heartbreak unfolding around him. "I'm going to take you somewhere," Lucas John said, doing his best to keep his voice gentle. "We're going to go away for a little while." "What about Mommy?" John didn't answer. He just held his son tightly and walked out of the house grounds. Every step was a farewell to the past, to his dreams, to what he had once called a family. Behind him, Sarah's voice rang out, "John, don't go. Please listen to me, I can explain." But John did not stop. He kept walking, holding his son close as if the boy were the last unbroken piece of the map of his life. Lucas looked up at his father with innocent eyes, not understanding why tears were running down the face of the hero he loved so dearly. "What's wrong, Daddy?" Lucas asked softly. "It's okay, son," John whispered, kissing his forehead. Daddy just needs you with him." And they walked away, leaving the White House behind, leaving the place John had once believed was paradise, now a place he never wanted to return to again. The fluorescent light in the motel room flickered on and off, giving off a steady buzzing sound like an insect's drone. The small, cramped room smelled of damp mildew, the wallpaper peeled away in patches, exposing dull gray concrete beneath. The narrow single bed creaked every time John shifted, and the sheets were yellowed with age. Lucas sat curled up in one corner of the bed, his blue eyes scanning the room with a mix of curiosity and confusion. "Daddy, why aren't we going home to sleep?" John sat beside him, one hand gently stroking the boy's sandy blonde hair. "We'll sleep here tonight, buddy, just you and me, like we're camping." "But I'm hungry," Lucas said softly, placing a small hand on his stomach. They hadn't eaten since noon, and it was already 8 o'clock in the evening. "I'll get you some food right now," John said, standing up and pulling out his phone. The old smartphone in his hand felt like the last thin thread connecting him to the outside world. He opened the banking app, his trembling finger tapping the screen. Then the screen loaded. "Account balance, $0." John stood frozen, staring at the impossible number. He refreshed the page, once, twice, 3 times. But the number didn't change. The joint account he shared with Sarah, the account that held every paycheck he had sent home over 8 months of deployment, along with their savings for a new house, was now completely empty. His finger scrolled down to the transaction history. A series of withdrawals over the past 3 days, all made by Sarah. The final transfer had gone through just a few hours earlier, right after John had left the house. "That can't be." John whispered, his legs suddenly weak. He collapsed into the rickety wooden chair nearby, his shaking hand gripping the phone. The phone vibrated. A text message from Sarah. John opened it, and the words appeared like knives stabbing straight into his chest. "You walked out of the house without a word. You took my son with you. Don't think you'll get away with this, John. I will call the police and report that you took Lucas without my consent. You know whose side the law is on. The mother is always given priority. Bring my son back, or you will face the consequences." John read the message again and again, each word hitting like a blow. My son. Not our son. In just a few hours, she had erased him from the family entirely. Another message appeared. This one was from David. "I'm sorry about how things turned out, but you need to understand that Sarah needed someone by her side while you were gone. Don't make things worse. I can arrange for you to see Lucas on weekends if you cooperate. Cooperate." The word echoed in John's mind like a cruel joke. The man who had betrayed him was now speaking as if John were the one in the wrong. John turned off the screen and set the phone down on the table. He looked up at the cracked ceiling, forcing himself to breathe evenly. His thoughts spiraled. Why did the woman I loved, the woman I trusted with my entire life, become so ruthless? Had she planned this all along, or was this a desperate act of self-defense after being caught? Daddy Lucas's voice pulled him back to the present. The boy crawled over and placed a small hand on John's knee. "Are you okay?" John bent down and pulled him into his arms. The child was so small, so warm, so heartbreakingly innocent. "I'm okay, buddy. I'm really hungry," Lucas said again, his voice still free of any complaint. John looked around the bare room. He had no money, no working credit cards. Everything was tied to the joint account that had been drained. In his pocket, he had only $20 in cash, the money he had withdrawn to buy gifts right after landing at the airport. $20. How long could that feed a child? John stood up and held the $20 bill in his hand. "I'm going to get you something to eat. You sit here and watch TV, okay?" Lucas nodded and turned on the old television. The screen flickered, then settled on a cartoon channel. He sat curled up again, eyes fixed on the screen, temporarily forgetting his hunger. John stepped out into the hallway and closed the door behind him. The dim hallway lights cast a long, thin shadow of him across the worn wooden floor. He leaned against the cold wall and slid down to the floor, burying his face in his hands. Everything had collapsed too fast. In just a few hours, he had lost his wife, his best friend, his home, his money, and now he was facing the possibility of losing his son. Sarah hadn't just betrayed him. She had prepared to strip away the last thing he had left. The phone vibrated again. John glanced down. An email from Sarah's lawyer, sent 2 hours earlier but only now seen. Subject line: notice regarding child custody and temporary orders. John didn't dare open it. He knew it would be filled with cold legal language threats wrapped in formal wording. David had connections. He had once bragged to John about friends in law and local government. Now those connections were being used to back John into a corner. A small sound came from inside the room. John stood up quickly and pushed the door open. Lucas was standing by the window, staring out at the dark street. "Daddy, when are we going home?" The innocent question struck John like a final blade to the heart. He walked over and knelt down at his son's level. "Buddy, we're going to stay here for a little while." "But I miss Mommy," Lucas said, his eyes shimmering. "Is she coming to get me?" John pulled him close, feeling the boy's warmth seep into him, the only thing left that made him feel human instead of completely shattered. "I'll take care of you, Lucas. I promise." But deep down, John knew how fragile that promise was. He had no money, no home, no job. And now he was being threatened with losing the only son he had left. Morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, falling across John's exhausted face. He hadn't slept at all through the night, lying awake and staring at the ceiling, counting each crack as if counting the broken pieces of his life. Lucas was curled up beside him, breathing steadily in a deep sleep. The phone vibrated. John looked down to see a message from Mark, his former army buddy. "John, I just heard some rumors. People are saying you're having trouble. Are you okay?" John frowned. "Rumors," he typed back. "What rumors?" A minute later, the phone buzzed repeatedly. Mark sent him a series of screenshots from veteran forums and local Facebook groups. The posts all carried the same message: veteran John Harper is showing signs of severe distress after returning home. His wife fears for the safety of their son. John has displayed unstable behavior and has even threatened his family. We need to help him before it's too late. John read every line, his blood seeming to freeze. The posts were being widely shared, with dozens of comments expressing sympathy for Sarah and condemning John. Someone even wrote, "I know soldiers often come back with psychological issues. Professional intervention is necessary." They were painting a picture he didn't recognize at all: a man out of control, dangerous, someone who needed to be kept away from his family. David and Sarah were using his military past, the very thing he had once been proud of, to turn him into a threat. John turned off the phone and placed it face down. His hands trembled. He felt as though he were sinking into quicksand. The harder he struggled, the deeper he sank. They had money connections, lawyers. And him. He had only the truth, but who would believe a homeless man with no money accused by his own wife of being mentally unstable? "Daddy." Lucas's soft voice came from the bed. John turned to see his son rubbing his eyes, his face flushed. "I feel hot." John placed a hand on Lucas's forehead. The boy had a fever, his skin was burning. "You've got a fever, buddy." John quickly grabbed a cold cloth and wiped his son's face. But inside his head, alarm bells were ringing. He had no money to buy medicine, no health insurance to take his son to a doctor. "I'll take care of you." "Don't worry," John said, forcing calm into his voice. He took the last $20 bill he had and rushed to a nearby drugstore, buying a bottle of fever medicine. When he paid, he realized he had only $3 left in his pocket. All day long, John stayed by Lucas's side. He wiped his face, gave him medicine, told him stories to distract him from the fever. But inside, John was slowly breaking. Everything was too heavy, too unfair. That evening, when Lucas finally fell asleep after the fever eased, John sat beside him looking at his son's rosy face. Dark thoughts began to creep into his mind. Should I give up? Would Lucas be better off with Sarah, unfaithful as she was, but at least she had money, a home, a stable life, and me? What did I have? Just a broken man who had lost everything in a single day. John stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city glittered with lights. Life went on as if nothing had happened. People walked by laughing, happy. They had no idea that just a few floors away, a man was standing on the edge of total collapse. "Daddy." Lucas's weak voice came from the bed. John turned back. The boy was lying on his side, eyes half open in a feverish haze. "Daddy, don't go away again." John rushed over and knelt beside the bed. Lucas reached out his small hand, gripping his father's finger tightly. "I'm scared. I'm scared you'll go far away again." John's tears spilled freely. He held that small hand and pressed it against his cheek. It was warm, soft, and full of trust, the belief that his father would always be there, would protect him, would never leave. And in that moment in the dark room amid the ruins of his life, a small flame ignited inside John. He could not give up. He could not let Lucas grow up believing his father had abandoned him. He could not let Sarah and David win through lies and manipulation. John took a deep breath and wiped his tears. He looked down at Lucas, now asleep again, still clutching his hand as if afraid he might disappear. And he realized something: he had made a mistake. He had let emotion take over, let pain cloud his judgment. But he was a soldier. He had been trained to face the worst situations, to find a way out when everything seemed hopeless. He needed to change tactics. He couldn't fight with emotion. He had to fight with strategy. He had to stay clear-headed. He had to gather evidence. He had to find allies. He had to rebuild piece by piece. John opened the old laptop on the table and began researching child custody, divorce law, how to fight false accusations. He took notes, made lists of what needed to be done. He needed a lawyer even without money. There were legal aid organizations for veterans. He needed to contact old friends who could testify to his character. He needed to save every message, every email from Sarah and David. They would be weapons in his hands. The night wore on. John didn't sleep, but this time it wasn't from despair. He stayed awake to prepare, to plan, to ready himself for the greatest battle of his life, not on a distant battlefield, but in the heart of the city, within the family he had once loved. Dawn began to break through the window, casting pale golden light into the room. Lucas was still sleeping soundly, his fever gone, his breathing steady. John looked at his son, then out at the sky. "I'll fight Lucas." John whispered, his voice firmer than it had ever been. "I won't let anyone take you from me, no matter what I have to face." And for the first time since stepping into the white-painted house 3 days earlier, John Harper no longer felt like a victim. He was a warrior, and the battle had only just begun. The law office of Adams and Associates was located on the third floor of an aging building in the city center. John stood outside the door, gripping his military duffel tightly, the last thing left from a past he had once been proud of. Lucas held his father's hand, his blue eyes darting around with curiosity. "I'm going to meet a friend, Lucas," John said softly. "You sit and play in the waiting room, okay?" The door opened and a tall man with graying hair stepped out, Michael Adams. John's comrade from 10 years earlier, the man who had shared long nights with him in the trenches. When Michael saw John, his face lit up, then quickly shifted to concern as he took in the exhaustion etched across his friend's features. "John." Michael stepped forward and shook his hand firmly. "You came to the right place." They sat down in Michael's private office while the secretary put on cartoons for Lucas outside. John told him everything from the moment he discovered the betrayal to the threatening messages, the drained bank account, and the smear campaign spreading online. Michael listened closely, taking careful notes, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "They're playing dirty," John Michael said when he finished. "But you know something, people who play dirty tend to make mistakes. They get overconfident. They think you're going to collapse. They don't know who you really are." "I've got nothing left," Michael, John said with a sigh. "No money, no home. How am I supposed to fight them?" Michael smiled the same smile John remembered from their days in combat when they faced situations that seemed impossible to survive. "You've got me. And you've got the truth. Those are the two strongest weapons there are, John. We'll rebuild from zero." Michael opened a file folder. "First, we need evidence. Do you have any recordings, texts, or emails from Sarah and David?" John took out his phone and showed him the threatening messages. Michael read them carefully and nodded. "Good. This shows she's deliberately trying to sabotage you. But we need more. We need to prove that she's been dishonest and is not fit to have full custody." But how, John asked, the familiar sense of helplessness creeping back in. Michael leaned forward. "You're going to go back to the house. Tell Sarah you want to collect your personal belongings, that you want to talk calmly for Lucas's sake. They'll think you've surrendered. And in reality, you'll be gathering evidence." Michael pulled out a small box. Inside were tiny surveillance cameras. "You'll install these in strategic locations. We need to record every conversation, every action they take when they think no one is watching. If they continue their inappropriate behavior, we'll have proof." John looked at the miniature cameras, feeling like a soldier being re-equipped before a mission. "What about the bank account? You need to find every document and statement related to those withdrawals. If Sarah emptied the account without legitimate cause, that's evidence of misappropriating joint assets. And if you can find any proof of a relationship with David before you came home, emails, texts, hotel receipts, the better our position will be." John nodded his mind, shifting into the familiar mode of tactical thinking. He was no longer a helpless victim. He was a fighter, planning a counteroffensive. "When should I start?" "As soon as possible." But John, Michael said, locking eyes with him, "You must stay absolutely calm. Don't let them provoke you. Don't let emotion take over. You're writing a silent score. Observe, document, withdraw." "Do you understand?" "I do," John replied firmly. They discussed many more details, legal loopholes they could exploit, potential witnesses, preparations for the upcoming court battle. When the meeting ended, John felt as though a heavy weight had been lifted. He was no longer alone. "Thank you, Michael. I don't know how to repay you." Michael placed a hand on John's shoulder. "Brothers in arms don't need thanks, John. We survived together. We fought together. This is no different." As they left the office, Lucas ran over and hugged his father's leg. "Daddy, I drew a picture for you." He handed John a sheet of paper. On it was a child's crayon drawing rough and uneven of a tall man holding hands with a small boy, a bright sun, and white clouds behind them. At the bottom, written in crooked letters, were the words, "Dad and me." John knelt down and hugged his son tightly, tears streaming down his face. That small drawing, imperfect, innocent, and overflowing with love, became the brightest flame in his heart, not for revenge, not for pride, but for Lucas, for the boy's future, because he deserved a father who would always be there, always fight for him. "I love it, buddy," John said, kissing Lucas on the forehead. "I'll keep this forever." They stepped out of the building into the glowing afternoon sunlight. John held the drawing firmly in his hand, drawing strength from those simple lines. His shoulders were no longer slumped. He walked upright, eyes forward toward the battle that lay ahead. That night back in the motel room, John sat down to plan in detail. He sketched a layout of the house, marking camera locations: the living room where Sarah and David often talked, the bedroom, Sarah's home office where she kept financial documents. He made a list of what to look for: bank contracts, credit card statements, anything that could prove the betrayal had been going on for some time. He glanced at the dad and me, drawing tape to the wall, his gaze steady. "Buddy, I'm going to bring you home, a real home where you're safe and truly loved." Lucas slept soundly on the bed, clutching his old teddy bear. Moonlight slipped through the window, illuminating the peaceful look on the boy's face. And John knew that no matter what he had to face, he would never give up. The battle had begun. And this time, John Harper would fight not with brute force, but with intelligence, patience, and the boundless love of a father. On Saturday morning, soft sunlight filtered through the trees lining the lake, scattering shimmering reflections across the water's surface. John and Lucas sat along the shore, two simple fishing rods planted in the ground, the taut lines responding to every small ripple. It was a rare moment when John felt the weight of the world lift. There was only birdsong, the rustle of wind through leaves, and the clear, joyful laughter of his son. "Daddy, the fish is about to bite," Lucas shouted excitedly, his eyes locked on the bobber bouncing on the water. John smiled and rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "You have to be patient, Lucas. Fishing is like a lot of things in life. If you rush, you'll miss your chance." Lucas nodded, trying his best to sit still, even though his small body trembled with excitement. Then the bobber dipped and the rod bent. Daddy, I got one." John helped Lucas pull up the line. A small perch flopped in the air. Lucas grinned from ear to ear, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "I did it, Daddy. I caught a fish. Well done, sweetheart." John hugged Lucas, feeling the boy's pure joy, untouched by the complications of the adult world. In that moment, John felt the wounds inside him from the battlefield, from betrayal, slowly begin to heal through his son's presence alone. They released the fish back into the lake and watched it swim away in the clear water. Lucas clapped his hands, then sat back down beside his father, resting his head on John's shoulder. "Daddy, I like being with you like this." "I like it too, Lucas." There was a brief silence, broken only by the gentle sound of water lapping the shore. Then Lucas spoke again, his voice innocent but carrying a question that made John tense. "Daddy, why does Uncle David come to our house so often?" John kept his tone calm and gentle. "He comes by a lot." "Yes," Lucas nodded. "Before you came home, he came almost every day. Mom said he was helping fix things around the house, but..." The boy hesitated, his face puzzled. "But what, buddy?" "But I saw Mom and Uncle David laughing a lot, and one night I woke up and heard talking in the living room. I went downstairs and saw Mom and Uncle David sitting really close together. Mom told me to go back to bed right away and not come down." Those innocent words were like puzzle pieces forming a picture John didn't want to complete. The betrayal hadn't been a single reckless moment. It had been ongoing, stretching across the months he was gone, fighting far away. While he faced danger, Sarah and David were building a relationship inside the very home where he had placed all his hopes. John took a deep breath, forcing back the surge of anger threatening to rise. But when he looked at Lucas, those innocent blue eyes unaware of what he had just revealed, he realized anger had no place here. What mattered was this child who trusted his father completely. "Daddy, did I do something wrong by telling you?" Lucas asked anxiously. No, you didn't do anything wrong at all. John gently stroked his son's hair. You were very brave to tell Daddy the truth. That afternoon, they returned to the motel room. John took out an old toy car of Lucas's that was missing a wheel. Let's fix it together, Lucas. They sat on the floor while John showed him how to use glue and simple tools to reattach the wheel. Lucas followed each step carefully, his tongue sticking out in concentration. When the car finally rolled again, the boy shouted with delight. Daddy, we did it. John looked at his son's beaming face and realized something. These moments, the simple, ordinary ones, were what truly mattered. Not money, not a big house, but the time a father spent with his child, his presence, his love shone through small acts. That night, after Lucas had fallen fast asleep, John sat by the window looking out over the city wrapped in darkness. He thought about what Lucas had shared about David, about Sarah, about the months he'd been gone. The anger was still there, but now it was wrapped in something else, compassion for his son. Lucas had been growing up in a world of lies with a dishonest mother, where the line between right and wrong was blurred. He deserved a better childhood, one not hidden behind dark secrets, not shaped by the wrongdoing of adults. John took out the Dad and Me drawing and stared at the crooked crayon lines. He realized the fight was no longer about him, not about Sarah's betrayal or David's deception. It was about Lucas, about saving the boy from a toxic environment where honesty was disregarded and love was only a performance. He opened his laptop and rewrote his goals. The goal is not to defeat Sarah. The goal is to protect Lucas, to ensure he grows up in a safe, healthy environment where he is taught the value of honesty and genuine love. John closed the laptop, feeling an unexpected calm. The bitterness had faded, replaced by a steady resolve, untouched by personal resentment. He would fight not for revenge, but to build a future for Lucas, a future the boy deserved. He looked at Lucas sleeping soundly, clutching his teddy bear, his lips curled into a small smile. And John knew that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, he would not back down. For Lucas, for a father's love, for mornings fishing by the lake, afternoons fixing toys, and the pure laughter untouched by lies. John walked to the bed and pulled the blanket up around his son. He bent down, kissed Lucas gently on the forehead, and whispered, I'll take you home to a real home, Lucas, a place where you're loved the right way. I promise. And in the quiet of the night inside the modest motel room, John Harper no longer felt like a broken man. He was a father, and that was the most important role he had ever held. Courtroom No. 4 was filled with light from tall windows, sunlight spilling across the polished wooden benches, and creating an atmosphere that was solemn yet heavy with pressure. John sat at the defendant's table wearing an old suit Michael had lent him, slightly too large across the shoulders. His hands were clenched, his knuckles pale, but his face remained composed, the calm of a soldier who had endured many battles. Across the room, Sarah sat beside her attorney, her face carefully made up, her brown hair softly curled. The elegant black dress she wore made her look like the picture of a devoted mother worried about her child. David sat behind her in a navy blue suit, repeatedly tapping on his phone as if trying to avoid meeting John's gaze. Judge Marianne Foster, a woman in her late 50s with silver hair and sharp, discerning eyes, tapped her gavel lightly. The court is now in session. This is the child custody dispute between Mr. John Harper and Mrs. Sarah Harper. Sarah's attorney, a gray-haired man named Mr. Donovan, stood first. He spoke with confidence. Your Honor, my client. Mrs. Sarah Harper is a devoted mother. For 8 months while her husband was away, she single-handedly cared for their son Lucas, ensuring the child had a stable life. In contrast, Mr. John Harper returned exhibiting signs of psychological distress after his time in combat. He behaved erratically, left the family home without notice, and took Lucas with him without the mother's consent. We believe custody should remain with Mrs. Harper to ensure Lucas's safety. The words echoed through the courtroom, and John felt all eyes turned toward him. But he did not flinch. He looked straight ahead at the judge, his posture steady. Michael Adams stood holding a thick folder. "Your Honor, we have evidence that tells a very different story from what opposing counsel has just presented." Michael activated the projector. The first images were screenshots of text messages between Sarah and David, messages sent over the past 6 months while John was still deployed. The content was unmistakably not that of casual friends, but of two people engaged in a romantic relationship. This evidence shows that Mrs. Sarah Harper and Mr. David Thompson were involved in an extramarital affair while her husband was serving his country, Michael said calmly but firmly. Sarah's face drained of color. Her attorney jumped up. "Objection. This is a violation of privacy." Judge Foster turned to Michael. "Mr. Adams, can you explain the source of this evidence, Your Honor? These messages were retrieved from a shared phone that my client and Mrs. Harper jointly used prior to their separation." "The evidence was obtained legally," Michael replied. The judge nodded. "Proceed." Michael continued playing video clips recorded from hidden cameras footage of Sarah and David in the living room, speaking intimately, laughing and engaging in gestures that clearly crossed the boundaries of friendship. As the court can see, this was not an isolated lapse in judgment. Sarah lowered her head, her shoulders trembling. David sat rigid, his face pale. Michael went on. "Furthermore, we have evidence that Mrs. Harper drained the couple's joint bank account over $45,000 immediately after Mr. Harper returned home. This constitutes unlawful appropriation of marital assets. The screen displayed bank statements clearly showing a series of withdrawals over 3 days, all initiated by Sarah." Mr. Donovan stood again, attempting a defense. "Your Honor, Mrs. Harper withdrew the funds out of fear for her financial safety and that of her son, given her husband's unstable behavior." Michael turned toward him, his voice cold. "If that were the case, why did she transfer $20,000 into the account of Mr. David Thompson?" Just 1 day later, the courtroom fell silent. Tears streamed down Sarah's face, but there was no longer any sympathy in the room. Then, the courtroom door opened. A woman entered, Linda Thompson, David's wife. She wore a simple suit and carried a stack of documents, her expression resolute despite her reddened eyes. "Your Honor," Linda said, her voice trembling but clear. "I am David Thompson's wife. I would like to submit the divorce petition I filed today after receiving evidence from Mr. John Harper of my husband's infidelity." She handed the documents to the court clerk. David stood abruptly, his face ashen. "Linda, please let me explain." "You don't need to explain anything," Linda said coldly. She then turned to the judge. "I want the court to know that for the past 6 months, my husband has repeatedly lied to me and been absent without explanation. Now I understand that he was destroying another family while abandoning his own." Judge Foster reviewed the evidence before her, her expression stern. She tapped her pen lightly on the desk, then looked directly at Sarah. "Mrs. Sarah Harper, do you have anything further to add?" Sarah shook her head, tears falling freely. She had nothing left to say. The judge delivered her ruling. Based on the evidence presented, the court awards temporary custody of the child to Mr. John Harper. Mrs. Harper will be granted supervised visitation on weekends. A formal hearing will be held in 3 months to determine final custody. The gavel struck officially, ending the session. John remained seated, showing no sign of triumph or satisfaction. He looked at Sarah, who had collapsed into her chair, her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs. He looked at David, who tried to approach Linda only to have her turn away without a trace of forgiveness. This was a victory for justice, for truth. But it was also the official death of a once happy family, of dreams once cherished, of promises once sworn. John stood and walked out of the courtroom. Michael placed a hand on his shoulder. "We won, John." "No," John shook his head, his voice low. "No one won, Michael. We just managed to save Lucas from something worse." Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun shone brightly. John looked toward the car where Lucas was waiting with a caregiver. The boy waved, his smile radiant. And John knew that although the past had shattered, the future still remained a future with Lucas, with genuine love, with dignity intact. The car rolled slowly down the familiar street, the maple trees on both sides swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. John held the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the white-painted house at the end of the block, the house he had dreamed of returning to for 8 long months, the house that now belonged to him and Lucas after the court's final ruling. Lucas sat in the back seat, his eyes glued to the window. "Daddy, we're really going home, aren't we?" "That's right, buddy," John replied, trying to sound cheerful. "We're going home." But when the car stopped in front of the house, John felt an indescribable heaviness settle over him. The house was still there, its white paint glowing in the afternoon sun, but it was no longer a symbol of happiness. It was the place where everything had fallen apart, the place where dreams had died. John opened the door and stepped inside. The air felt cold even though the weather was still warm. The living room was bare. Sarah had taken some of the furniture with her when she moved out. The gray sofa was still there, but the soft throw pillows she used to arrange so carefully were gone. The coffee table no longer held magazines or scented candles. On the walls, the family photo frames had been removed, leaving behind lighter patches like scars marking where memories had once hung. Lucas ran into his bedroom, his small footsteps pattering across the wooden floor. John stood in the middle of the living room looking around. He had won. He had reclaimed the house, reclaimed custody of his son. But the victory brought none of the joy he had imagined. Instead, it left a hollow feeling like a battlefield after the war had ended, silent, devastated, filled with fragments that could never be put back together. Daddy Lucas ran back out, his eyes shining. "My toy cabinet is empty. Mommy took my big teddy bear." John knelt down and hugged him. "I'll buy you a new bear, Lucas. Don't worry." "But I like the old one," Lucas said, his voice innocent yet heavy with sadness John could clearly feel. "Mommy gave it to me for my birthday last year." That night, John cooked a simple dinner, spaghetti and meatballs. They ate quietly, the only sound the clink of forks against plates. Lucas barely touched his food, his eyes lowered, the usual excitement gone. "You're not very hungry?" John asked. "I miss Mommy's cooking," Lucas said softly. "She used to make chicken soup for me. I really liked it." John felt as if a stone had settled on his chest. He knew Lucas didn't fully understand what had happened. The boy only knew that his mother wasn't here anymore, and that life had changed. For a 4-year-old, the change was too big, too sudden. After dinner, John bathed Lucas, read him a story, and tucked him into bed. "Sleep well, Lucas." Daddy Lucas held his father's hand tightly, looking up with worried eyes. "When can I see Mommy this weekend?" John said, gently stroking his son's hair. "You'll see Mommy this weekend. She still loves you very much, Lucas. It's just that Mommy and Daddy don't live in the same house anymore." "Why don't Mommy and Daddy live together?" Lucas asked, his voice full of innocent confusion. John didn't know how to answer. How could he explain betrayal lies and painful adult decisions to a 4-year-old? "Sometimes," he said slowly, "grown-ups have to make very difficult choices. But what matters is that Mommy and Daddy both love you very much." Lucas was quiet for a moment, then rolled onto his side, hugging the small teddy bear he still had. "Okay," he whispered, and closed his eyes. John stayed by his side until Lucas drifted off, then quietly left the room. He went downstairs to the living room and sat on the sofa, resting his head in his hand. The house was frighteningly silent. No soft sound of Sarah humming while washing dishes, no low television noise in the background, only the steady ticking of the wall clock, the sound of time passing, of lonely days stretching ahead. John looked around the room. He had won, but now he faced the reality of being a single father. He would have to cook, clean, do laundry care for Lucas after school, take him to the doctor when he was sick, attend parent-teacher meetings, and most of all, he would have to be both father and mother in his son's heart. In the middle of the night, John was awakened by soft crying. He hurried upstairs to Lucas's room. The boy was sitting up in bed, tears streaming down his cheeks, clutching his teddy bear tightly. "What's wrong, buddy?" John pulled him into his arms. I dreamed about Mommy," Lucas sobbed, his voice breaking. "I dreamed she was home cooking for me, but when I woke up she wasn't here." John felt his heart shatter. He held his son close, gently rubbing his back. "I know you miss Mommy, Lucas. I understand, but you'll see her soon, and Daddy will always be here with you. I'll never leave you." "Do you promise?" Lucas looked up at him, his eyes red and swollen. "I promise," John said firmly. He stayed with Lucas until the boy fell asleep again, then returned to his own room. John lay on the bed he had once shared with Sarah, now half empty. He stared at the ceiling, feeling loneliness seep into every part of him. Justice had been served. He had reclaimed what was rightfully his. But justice could not mend a child's broken heart. It could not erase the nights Lucas cried for his mother. It could not fill the emptiness in this house. John closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew he had no other choice. Lucas needed him, and he would learn to become the best father he could be, not only through love, but through patience, presence, and sacrifice. A year had passed. The white-painted house now carried new marks of life, Lucas's drawings taped to the walls, a new swing in the backyard flower pots that John and his son had planted together along the porch. Autumn had returned, and yellow leaves drifted down, covering the walkway. John stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast. He had grown used to the routine, pouring milk for Lucas, toasting bread, frying eggs. His hair was longer now, a few more gray strands showing at his temples, but his eyes no longer carried the exhaustion of the year before. In its place was a quiet sense of peace, peace that came from acceptance and letting go. "Daddy, I have a math test today." Lucas ran down the stairs, his backpack slung crookedly over one shoulder, his face glowing. He was 5 now, taller, more talkative, but still wearing the same innocent smile. "I know you'll do great," John said, ruffling his son's hair as he set a plate of toast on the table. "Eat your breakfast, and I'll take you to school." They ate together in a warm, easy atmosphere. Lucas chattered about his classmates, about the puppy his teacher had brought to class the day before. John listened, smiling occasionally, asking questions to keep the story going. These were the moments he treasured most, simple moments yet full of meaning. After dropping Lucas off at school, John returned home to get ready for work. He had found a steady job with a security company, working the morning shift so he could pick Lucas up after school. Life wasn't luxurious, but it was enough. And most important of all, he had time for his son. That afternoon, as John was hanging laundry in the backyard, his phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number appeared. "John, this is Sarah. Could we meet? There's something I need to say." John looked at the message, a strange feeling rising within him. A year earlier, Sarah's name still caused him pain. Now it was just a word, a name that no longer carried sharp emotion. He typed back, "All right. Tomorrow, 0 p.m. Central Park Cafe." The next day, John arrived early at the cafe. He chose a table by the window and waited with a cup of black coffee. The afternoon sunlight streamed softly through the glass, casting warm golden streaks across the wooden tabletop. Then the door opened. Sarah walked in. John caught his breath when he saw her. She was no longer the confident, radiant woman she had been a year earlier. Her long brown hair was now cut to her shoulders, her face thin, her eyes swollen as if from many nights of crying. She wore an old sweater, no longer the elegant dresses she once favored. "Hello, John," Sarah said. As she sat down, her voice quiet, stripped of its former confidence. "Sarah," John replied with a calm nod. A long silence followed. Sarah stared down at the table, gripping her small handbag tightly. Then she spoke. "I'm sorry, John. I'm sorry for everything I did." John didn't answer right away. He looked at her, the woman he had once loved deeply, the woman he had believed he would grow old with. Now she felt like a stranger with a familiar face. "I know an apology can't erase what I've done," Sarah continued, tears beginning to form. I destroyed everything. I destroyed our family. I destroyed your trust. I have no excuse. I just want you to know that I regret it every single day. John took a sip of his coffee, letting the moment settle. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. Why come back now, Sarah? Because I realized I've lost everything, Sarah said through tears. David left me right after the trial. He said he didn't want any responsibility. I lost my job because of the rumors. I lost my friends because they no longer trusted me. And most of all, I lost Lucas, our son. I miss him, John. I miss him every day. John remained silent, looking out the window. Leaves drifted down outside, marking the passage of time. What do you want from me, Sarah? I want your forgiveness, she said, her voice breaking. I know we can never go back to how things were. But I want to see Lucas more. I want him to know that his mother still loves him. John turned back to her. There was no hatred in his eyes now, but no affection either. I won't stop you from seeing him, Sarah. Lucas needs his mother, but you need to understand custody will remain with me, and you'll have to prove that you deserve his trust again. I understand, Sarah nodded. I'll do whatever it takes to be closer to him. John stood ready to leave. Sarah rose as well, her voice trembling. John, do you still remember us? The happy days we had. John paused and looked at her. For a brief moment, old memories surged back, the wedding beneath falling petals, mornings waking in each other's arms, Sarah's laughter filling the house. But they were only ghosts of the past. You killed the man who loved you. Sarah, John said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. All that stands here now is Lucas's father. That man, the one who loved you with everything he had, is gone. Sarah collapsed back into her chair, sobbing. But John didn't turn around. He walked out of the cafe, greeted by the bright afternoon sun. He took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill his lungs. The pain was still there, but it no longer stabbed like it once had. Now it was a scar, a part of the past he had accepted. He had learned to forgive, not to free Sarah, but to free himself. Free from hatred, from torment, from what could never be changed. That afternoon, when John picked Lucas up from school, the boy ran into his arms. Daddy, I did really well on my test. John lifted him up and kissed his forehead. Well done, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you. They walked home together in the golden afternoon light. Lucas chatting excitedly about his day, John listening with a smile. The past was behind them. The ghosts had been faced, and now only the future remained, a future with Lucas, with genuine love, with the peaceful days he had fought so hard to reclaim. The Veterans Affairs office was housed in an old red brick building, but inside it was filled with warm light. John sat at his desk, a stack of case files in front of him, files belonging to veterans who needed support. He had been working here for 6 months now, a job that not only provided steady income, but also gave his life renewed purpose. John, could you speak with Mr. Thompson Maria? His co-worker stepped in, holding a folder. He just got back and is having a hard time adjusting. John nodded and stood up. He walked into the counseling room where a young man sat, hunched over shoulders, slumped exhaustion written across his face. John recognized that look. He himself had worn it 2 years earlier. Mr. Thompson. I'm John Harper, he said, shaking the young man's hand. I served too. I understand what you're going through. They talked for over an hour. John listened, shared his own experiences, never judging, never rushing to give advice. He simply stayed present like a companion, like a safe harbor in the middle of a storm. When Mr. Thompson left, his face looked less tense, his eyes carrying a small spark of hope. Thank you, John. For the first time in months, I don't feel alone anymore. John smiled and gave his shoulder a gentle pat. You're never alone. We're brothers. That afternoon, John picked Lucas up from school as usual. The boy was bigger now, more talkative, yet still wonderfully innocent. They stopped by the ice cream shop and bought 2 chocolate popsicles, both of their favorites. "Daddy, my teacher said my handwriting is really good today," Lucas said, his mouth smeared with chocolate. "Did he?" "I'll have to see that," John replied, his heart swelling with pride. When they got home, they prepared dinner together. Lucas helped wash the vegetables and set the table. These small chores had become a daily ritual, a simple routine filled with meaning binding father and son together. After dinner, as night settled in, they sat out on the porch. The sky was clear, the stars sparkling like scattered diamonds. Lucas leaned against his father's shoulder as they gazed upward. "Daddy," Lucas said softly, "are you sad?" John was slightly taken aback. "Why do you ask?" "Because sometimes I see you staring far away like you're thinking about something," Lucas said, his innocent blue eyes looking up at him. John was quiet for a moment, then pulled his son into his arms. "I'm not sad, son. I'm thinking about what I managed to protect." "What did you protect?" Lucas asked curiously. John looked at him, then back up at the star-filled sky. "I protected you. I protected our little family. I protected the most precious thing I have." Lucas smiled and hugged him tightly. "I love you so much, Daddy." "I love you too, Lucas, more than anything in this world." They sat in silence, sharing each other's warmth. The stars above shimmered like gentle reminders that after darkness comes light, and after every storm comes peace. Later, when Lucas was fast asleep in his room, John sat at his desk and opened his old journal. He picked up a pen and wrote his final lines. "2 years ago, I came home from the battlefield thinking my war was over. I was wrong. The real battle had just begun, not in some distant land, but within my own family, within relationships I once believed were unbreakable. I lost my wife. I lost my closest friend. I lost my faith in love. But I regained what mattered most, my son and my self-respect. The true battle is not about defeating an enemy. It is about preserving your humanity when everything around you is falling apart. It is choosing forgiveness over hatred. It is building instead of destroying. I have learned that a man's greatest strength does not lie in muscles or physical power. It lies in his ability to open his arms and shield those he loves from life's storms. It lies in standing firm when everything is shaking and continuing forward when everyone else has given up. I am no longer a soldier returning from war. I am a father, and that is the title I am most proud of in my life." John set the pen down and looked out the window. The night sky was quiet, the stars still glowing. He stood and walked into Lucas's room. The boy slept soundly, clutching his teddy bear, a small smile resting on his lips. John sat beside the bed and gently stroked his son's blonde hair. In this moment, all the pain, all the loss, all the sleepless nights, everything had meaning. For Lucas, for that innocent smile, for the future he was building one day at a time. "My son John," whispered, "I've fought in many places around the world, but the greatest battle I ever fought was the battle to protect you. And I won, Lucas, not because I was strong, but because I had you. You are the brightest star in my darkest sky." He kissed his son's forehead, then quietly stepped out and closed the door. Outside, the night remained peaceful. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, creating a gentle whispering sound. John stepped onto the porch, sat down in the wooden chair, and looked up at the star-filled sky. He had found peace, not the kind that comes from the absence of war, but the kind that comes from accepting the past, living fully in the present, and trusting in the future. And as the first light of dawn began to appear on the horizon, John Harper, soldier fatherman weathered by storms, smiled, because he knew that whatever tomorrow might bring, he was ready, not alone, but with Lucas, his guiding star. And that was the true victory, not on the battlefield, but in the heart. The story of John and Lucas reminds us that a father's greatest strength does not lie in defeating others, but in refusing to let go of his child when everything else falls apart. All it takes is one adult who is clear-minded and loving enough, and a child does not have to grow up surrounded by hurt and deception. If this story resonated with you, please follow and share it to help spread stories about responsibility, truth, and fatherhood, because somewhere out there are still Lucases waiting for a father who will stand firm, and Johns who need to know that their steadfastness can change an entire life.